Big Shaq walks into the airport looking like he's got nothing left. Tattered clothes, worn shoes, heads turning for all the wrong reasons. Laughter follows him like a shadow. But the moment that plane hits 30,000 feet, the joke flips, and the very people who laughed are left stunned, silenced and staring at a truth they never saw coming. What looked like homelessness was a storm in disguise. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was just past noon when he walked into Atlanta International Airport. Tall, slow-stepping, carrying the kind of weight that didn't come from his bag. His jeans were frayed, his sweatshirt looked slept in, and his shoes, once pristine size 22s, were dull and bent at the heel. He looked like he hadn't seen a mirror in weeks, but he didn't look broken. Not in the way people expected. Big Shaq. Yes, that Shaq didn't need to make an entrance. He was the entrance. Even when dressed like he'd been sleeping, in the back of a Salvation Army truck, the energy shifted around him. He didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't check a phone, just walked with that same gravity he carried on the court, back when gravity bent for him. No one recognized him at first. That's how far he'd taken the disguise. Or maybe it wasn't a disguise. Maybe it was a choice, a message. The woman at the coffee kiosk noticed first. Her name tag read, Tori, and her eyes trailed him like she was seeing something she couldn't place. Her hand stopped mid-latte as he passed. She tilted her head, frowned, turned to say something to the barista beside her. That guy looks like Shaquille O'Neal if he'd, hit rock bottom. Passengers leaned into each other, murmuring, some smirking. The guy in the three-piece suit, near gate 14, scoffed. Dude's lost everything. You can tell. His voice wasn't low enough to hide the judgment. Another woman near the departures board whispered, he looks like he hasn't slept in days. What happened to him? He didn't flinch. He didn't rush. His movements were smooth and deliberate, like each step was a decision. He passed a child playing on the floor, and without a word picked up the toy car the kid had dropped, and handed it back. The boy's mother offered a quick, startled thank you, but he just nodded, and kept walking. A tiny moment, barely noticeable, but the kind of thing that people remember when everything else starts to unravel. When he reached the main terminal, he stopped, right under the massive departure board, blinking with cities and delays. He looked up, not at the screens, but at the light streaming in from the skylights above. His face, unshaven, worn, creased with time, caught the sun like a sculpture. The image was jarring. This wasn't a man lost. This was a man listening, watching, waiting. Behind the Delta counter, a trio of staffers exchanged glances. The youngest of them, Riley, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "We got a homeless guy trying to buy first class." He snorted, loud enough. Shaq didn't respond, but his eyes cut to the side for a second, a single second, like a lighthouse sweeping across a storm. Then he walked toward check-in. A mother pulling two toddlers aside, glanced at him nervously, adjusting her purse strap like it might go missing just by proximity. A businessman pretending not to stare still positioned his carry-on between himself and the tall stranger. No one said anything, but their movements said everything. Shaq stood in line, quiet, still, the type of still that draws attention because it doesn't ask for it. He looked at no one, but everyone looked at him. The curiosity had shifted. Whispers were turning into theories. Someone pulled out a phone, started recording. From behind the counter, Riley called out with exaggerated patience, "Sir, can I help you?" The tone made it sound like he wasn't really offering help, more like daring him to cause a scene. The other agents tried not to look directly at the situation brewing. Shaq stepped forward, reached into his backpack. It was a plain weathered thing. Zippers worn down, one strap repaired with duct tape. He pulled out a printed itinerary. His fingers were rough, but steady. He slid the paper across the counter, without a word. Riley barely glanced at it before raising a skeptical brow. "You sure this is yours?" The pause that followed was dense, long enough for a silence to stretch thin over the entire counter area. Shaq tilted his head slightly. That was his answer. Riley punched in the reservation code. The screen blinked. His eyes widened slightly. "This says VIP clearance." He tapped again. "You are cleared for priority 1, pre-board, flagged with red star access. Who did you book this with?" Shaq didn't blink, didn't speak. Riley shifted in his seat, discomfort crawling up his neck. "You don't look like... this seems off." A manager nearby, Dana, finally stepped in. Older, more seasoned, with a sharp eye. She glanced at the screen, then at the man in front of her. Her face changed. She recognized him. Not immediately, but enough. Enough to know this was a situation she didn't want to escalate. "Let him through," she said quietly. Riley hesitated. "But," I said, "let him through." Shaq nodded once, then picked up his backpack and moved toward the security lane. As he walked, phones rose again. Clicks and quiet recordings followed him, like shadows. But he moved like he didn't hear any of it. Or maybe like he'd heard it all before. A group of teenagers watched from a row of seats by the terminal windows. One of them, a girl with curly brown hair and big headphones around her neck, whispered, "That's him. That's Shaq. What the hell is going on?" Her friend frowned. "Nah. Shaq would never let himself get like that." "But what if he chose to?" the first girl asked. "What if it's like a test?" That idea stuck. Floated in the air. Security was uneventful. Surprisingly so. The TSA officer, a tall man with a buzz cut and a nameplate that read N. Bailey, opened the bag without a word. Inside were folded clothes, a pack of chewing gum, a first aid kit, and one framed photograph. A boy, about 11, smiling, afro-puffed and proud, wearing a basketball jersey, and standing in front of a community center with the word Hope House painted in peeling letters. Bailey stared at the photo for a second longer than he needed to. He looked up. And for the first time in the entire process, Shaq met someone's gaze. Bailey's expression shifted. Something settled in his posture, a slow, dawning awareness. He closed the bag carefully, zipped it shut. "You're good, sir." Shaq nodded once, slung the backpack over his shoulder, and walked on. He didn't head for a lounge, didn't stop at the newsstand, or the overpriced gift shop. He moved toward the gates with the same quiet momentum, eyes scanning, steps. Near gate 12B, a young janitor with a mop paused as Shaq passed. He looked up, recognized him instantly, but said nothing, just gave him a nod. A real one. Not fanboy awe, but respect. Shaq returned it. The briefest smile cracked his face. Not for show. For real. He sat at an empty terminal bench, far from the noise. The sun angled through the window and lit his face in slashes of gold. He pulled out a small notebook. Pages filled with scribbles, quotes, half-thoughts, and prayers. He flipped to the last entry. There was a name circled twice. Kendrick Jewell. And underneath it, in block letters, "They forgot his face. I won't." He stared at the name for a while. Not like he was reading it, like he was remembering it. Behind him, another group of employees gossiped under their breath. "That guy's definitely got mental health issues," someone said. "He looked at me like he could see right through me," another added. "Yeah, well, if he really is Shaq," a third chimed in. "Dude must have cracked. Rich people lose it all the time." They laughed. But their laughter was thin. It didn't sit right. Not anymore. And as the boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, and people began to line up like cattle for the jet bridge, Big Shaq stayed seated, watching, waiting, like a man who already knew this flight was going to change more than just where people landed. Because for Shaq, it wasn't about the destination. It was about the walk through the judgment, through the whispers, through the looks and the labels, and about what waited on the other side of it all. The buzz at the check-in counters was a blend of mechanical efficiency and idle distraction. Screens blinked with departure times, boarding groups flickered into new orders, and overhead announcements looped like background static in a place that never really slept. The staff moved in rhythm, swipe, scan, nod, print, but boredom seeped through the cracks. Everyone was performing, but no one was really watching, until he approached. Shaq stepped into the line marked priority in first class. The sign stood tall on a metal post, clear as daylight, but that didn't stop the eyes from narrowing. A few heads popped up like radar pings. Some passengers adjusted their stance, looking at him, then looking at the sign again, as if it might change on second glance. At counter 3, Riley leaned forward on his elbows, flicking his ID badge back and forth. His uniform was crisp, his sneakers brand new, and his confidence came with the kind of arrogance that thrives in small positions of power. He noticed Shaq the second he entered the queue. Everyone did, but Riley didn't blink. Not yet. Instead, he leaned sideways toward his coworker, a woman named Elise, no older than 22, with nervous energy that clung to her like static. Riley smirked. his voice just above a whisper but sharpened enough to cut through the air. Another one thinking first class is a mindset, not a bank account. Elise glanced up, her eyes catching the shape of Shaq's massive frame. She let out a low chuckle, half-hearted, unsure, but she didn't correct him. Riley added, "Dude looks like he just walked off a sidewalk sermon. You think he's trying to manifest a seat?" The joke wasn't clever, but it landed. Another staffer 2 counters down heard it, and laughed. Short, sharp, the kind that wants to be in on something mean. The sound rippled outward. Judgment didn't need full sentences. A look, a snort, a whispered insult. It was a language spoken fluently here. Shaq reached the counter. Not Riley's. Dana's. She was the shift manager. Mid-40s, eyes like searchlights, a past carved into her skin that made her seem older than she was. She didn't move like the others. She was more careful, more guarded. She looked at him and paused. Something flickered across her face. Not recognition, not fully, but discomfort. Like she just realized she was in the presence of someone she couldn't quite categorize. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, with practiced calm, she asked for his ID. Shaq reached into his backpack, pulled out the same weather-worn folder he'd used earlier, and slid it across the desk. Riley leaned over from his station. "He got a ticket?" He said it with mock surprise, dragging the syllables. Dana didn't respond. She tapped her keyboard. Her screen blinked, and her brow furrowed. A flash of red, then gold. A private security clearance level few passengers ever saw. VIP override. Manual confirmation by upper-level corporate. Shaq's name sat at the top of the manifest, stamped in bold. Shaq O'Neal. Not a booking error. Not a prank. Not a delusion. Dana exhaled slowly. Behind them, Elise leaned toward Riley again. "Is it him?" Riley shrugged. "Even if it is, look at him. This isn't how you fly when you've got a net worth in the hundreds. He's either lost it all, or he's doing some kind of weird performance art. Rich people do that crap." Passengers in line started pulling out phones. Some were already filming, pretending to check text but angling their cameras just right. A middle-aged woman 2 spots back was already uploading to her social media, captioning it, "Shaquille O'Neal at ATL, looking broke. What happened?" The photo caught him mid-blink. Unflattering, unfair, but it would travel faster than any truth ever could. Dana cleared her throat. "Mr. O'Neal, your flight to DC is confirmed. I see the Red Star clearance here. You'll be pre-boarded after our special service guests." Riley raised a brow. "Red Star? What's that, celebrity grief points?" Dana's voice sharpened. Still quiet. "Go refill the printer ink." It was the closest she'd come to reprimanding him. Riley rolled his eyes and walked off, but not without tossing one last smirk toward Shaq. Shaq stood still, unmoving. Not cold, not angry, just heavy. Heavy in presence, in silence, in something that couldn't be named, but was deeply felt. He turned slightly, just enough to catch a reflection in the glossy departure monitor behind Dana's desk. The image showed himself, distant and grainy, surrounded by people watching him like he was an exhibit. The man who once had the world's attention now had its suspicion. A child stepped out from behind her father in line. Little girl, maybe 8, holding a doll with yarn hair. She stared at Shaq with wide eyes. No fear, just curiosity. The kind that hadn't yet learned what judgment tastes like. Her father, noticing her gaze, gently pulled her back, whispering something into her ear. She looked down, ashamed, though she hadn't done anything. Dana printed the boarding pass and slid it across the counter. Shaq took it without a word. Behind him, someone coughed deliberately, a nudge to get him moving. He stepped aside. The laughter hadn't stopped. It had just gone underground, into looks, smirks, quiet swipes on screen. But the energy had changed. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was unease. A kind of squirming discomfort that comes from realizing you may have misread something vital. He walked toward the seating near Gate 12B. Chose the far corner bench again, the same one he'd waited at before. He sat with his backpack on his lap, arms crossed over it like it held something precious. Not valuable, precious. There's a difference. Near the vending machines, 2 off-duty pilots were talking in low voices. One of them glanced Shaq's way, then muttered, "What's the play here? PR stunt? Publicity rehab?" The other shrugged. "I don't think it's for us. I think it's for him." The first pilot frowned. "Still, You walk into a place like this dressed like that, you know what reaction you'll get? Maybe that was the point. Another notification popped up on the airport monitors. Weather delay. Incoming storm off the coast was pushing back flights. The crowd groaned. People grumbled. Tension thickened. Everyone wanted to be somewhere else. But no one was moving. Shaq didn't react. Just sat. Still. Scanning. Riley returned to the counter, coffee in hand, and nodded toward Dana. We get clearance to start pre-boarding when the delay lifts. Dana didn't answer. She was still looking at her monitor, lost in a screen she wasn't reading. Something had unsettled her. Not fear, guilt, maybe, or memory. Behind Shaq, a woman in her 50s stood from her seat and approached slowly. Her name was Caroline, a former school counselor on her way to a reunion in Boston. She recognized him, not from the internet, from something deeper, a memory of watching him speak at a juvenile center a decade ago. She remembered his words, calm, grounded, aimed straight at kids who had nothing but rage in their pockets. She hesitated before approaching. Didn't say anything. Just placed a sealed bottle of water on the bench beside him and walked away. No fanfare, no acknowledgement expected. Just a gesture, a correction. He didn't turn, but his hand moved to the bottle, rested on it for a beat, then gripped it. The storm delay stretched another 30 minutes. Shaq remained quiet. Phones stayed up. Conversations shifted. Some passengers were starting to whisper less about what he looked like and more about what he might be doing there. Maybe he was undercover. Maybe it was a story that would drop tomorrow. Maybe. And this one started to spread faster than the rest. Maybe he was here because someone else couldn't be. Someone younger. Someone gone. None of them knew the name Kendrick Jules. Not yet. But the sense that they had misunderstood the whole story, that feeling had started to set in like a slow sunrise. Back at the counter, Riley checked his watch. You think he's gonna pull off the disguise all the way through the flight? He asked Dana. Dana didn't answer. She was watching the security footage feed behind her monitor. She rewound a few seconds, stopped, rewound again. She watched the moment Shaq had handed that toy car to the little boy earlier. Watched the quiet way he moved, the way he never asked for attention, the way he never needed it. And suddenly, she remembered something. A community fundraiser. Years ago, a speaker had shown up unannounced, paid for the gymnasium's entire renovation with one check, then disappeared before anyone could say thank you. There hadn't been press, no photos, but the speaker was tall, very tall. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She didn't type. Shaq sat still at gate 12, waiting, not for the plane, but for the moment everything would finally reveal itself. Security lines at Atlanta International moved with that frustrating blend of sluggishness and sudden bursts. Passengers sighed, adjusted carry-ons, shuffled forward in inch-long increments. Impatience was the only thing traveling fast. But in lane 4, motion stalled entirely. Shaq had reached the TSA checkpoint. He stood out not just because of his size, but because of his stillness. In a crowd of restless limbs and shifting feet, he moved like a rock in a river. The current bent around him. A few agents glanced up. Their gazes lingered for reasons they couldn't explain. Something about the way he held his bag, the quiet conviction in his silence, the exhaustion behind his eyes. It pulled their attention even before the scanner beeped. Then it did. A flash of red on the screen. Secondary inspection triggered. A uniformed officer gestured calmly. Sir, step this way. Shaq nodded, barely perceptible. No complaint, no protest. He followed. They led him to a quiet table, near the back wall. Not the kind for threats, but for unknowns. People who didn't fit categories. People who made agents whisper. Just make sure. The officer assigned to him was Nathaniel Briggs, 37, clean-cut, sharp-eyed, and composed like someone who carried rules like armor. But when Shaq sat across from him, Nathaniel felt a strange sensation creep through his spine. Not fear, not intimidation. Something more personal. Something almost like recognition. He couldn't place it. Backpack, please, Briggs said with practiced neutrality. Shaq slid it forward. The canvas was faded, stained at the seams, and held together at one strap with gaffer's tape. It made a soft clink when it touched the metal table, not the sound of electronics. Something denser. Briggs unzipped the main pocket. No laptop, no toiletries, no books, no headphones. Instead there were layers, folders worn to the point of transparency. envelopes with bent corners, and old receipts so faded they looked like ghosts on paper. He pulled them out slowly. The first was a stack of handwritten letters, all addressed to the same person, Kendrick Jules. Each envelope bore different senders, names like Pastor Roy, Coach Tim, Ms. Gerda from science class. The dates stretched across nearly a decade. The ink was smudged on some, tear-stained on others. Beneath them lay a sheaf of hospital bills, all addressed to Lucille O'Neill, Shaq's mother, but they weren't hers. The patient names listed were different: Marcus Jules, Yvette Jules, Kendrick Jules. The same family, different tragedies, one series of system failures repeated in different forms. Briggs paused. He wasn't supposed to read details, but he did. Eyes skimming, a brain injury, untreated asthma, a denied transplant referral, everything stamped out of network. A pattern emerged, slow, deliberate, cruel. Then came the photograph. A single frame. Wooden, the kind you'd find in a corner store on clearance. Nothing fancy. Inside it, a boy, no older than 11, grinning with pride. He wore an oversized basketball jersey, one sleeve slipping down his shoulder. He stood in front of a low brick building with a painted sign that read, Hope House Community Shelter. The paint on the wall behind him was cracked. The joy in his smile wasn't. Briggs stared at the photo. Something in his chest shifted. A buried memory, tugged forward by a face he'd never met but somehow knew. Shaq hadn't moved. He watched Briggs carefully. Not like a man expecting confrontation, but like a man waiting to see if someone else would finally understand. Briggs set the frame down gently. Who is he? He almost asked aloud. But something in the air told him not to. The answer wasn't his to demand. Not yet. He moved to the next pocket, pulled out a folded poster, a flyer printed on cheap stock paper, corners curled. The image was grainy. A group of teens in front of a community gym. Shaq stood in the middle, towering, smiling, surrounded by kids who looked at him like he was the sun. The caption below read, Big Shaq Mentorship Night, One Shot, One Future. Dated 6 years ago. Briggs stopped. Now it was starting to click. He remembered that initiative. Barely made the news. A quiet program. Privately funded. Targeting high-risk teens in 3 states. No fanfare. Just presence. Shaq had made surprise visits to centers, offered full college scholarships, and paid for therapy for kids whose names never appeared in headlines. There were no cameras, no interviews, just impact. Briggs looked at the man across from him again. This wasn't a celebrity gone rogue. This was a man who'd carried stories most people had never heard, and never would. But Briggs had heard whispers. He slid everything back into the bag. Slower now, more careful. Shaq watched him the entire time. Not judging, not rushing, just observing. His stillness wasn't passive. It had weight. When Briggs zipped the bag closed, he looked him in the eye. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not questions, just an understanding. Briggs nodded once. A small gesture, but it carried something real. Respect. Maybe even apology. You're cleared, he said, though Shaq already knew he would be. Shaq took the bag, slung it back over his shoulder, and walked out of the inspection area, without looking back. But Briggs sat there for another 10 seconds, staring at the photo still etched into his mind. He didn't know Kendrick Jules, but he felt the shadow of that boy's story pressing into his chest. Back in the terminal, Shaq walked past the food court, the overpriced souvenir store, and the wall of magazines, featuring faces who would never walk through the world the way he had just walked through security. People still glanced, still wondered, but the whispers had slowed. Doubt was being replaced by discomfort, the kind that happens when people realize they may have misjudged something deeply. He passed a young couple, arguing in hushed tones, their body language sharp, frustration radiating from their eyes. They stopped mid-sentence, as Shaq passed, not because he interrupted them, but because they felt something in his presence that made their fight feel small. A man on his phone turned to catch a glimpse. His voice dropped. Whoa. I swear it's him. But he looks like a ghost walking in daylight. Shaq made his way back toward gate 12B, where the bench waited like a paused memory. He sat down again, same corner seat, same posture, like he'd never left, like he was holding a vigil. In his lap the backpack rested quietly. No designer bag, no tech, no assistants trailing him, just a history in canvas. a boy in a photo, and the weight of promises made long ago. Briggs, now back at his post, couldn't shake the image from his mind. When his shift ended, he wouldn't tell his coworkers about it, wouldn't post online, wouldn't brag about inspecting a legend. But he would go home and look up the name Kendrick Jules. He would dig into old local reports about a boy who'd gone missing in the system, shuffled from shelter to shelter, misdiagnosed, denied, forgotten, until the day he wasn't. Because someone had remembered. Someone had carried his photo through airports, across cities, into courtrooms. Someone dressed like pain to reflect the world's. A notification buzzed overhead. Boarding Group A was being prepped for movement. Flight 237 to Washington, D.C. was back on schedule. Shaq remained seated, watching, waiting. Not for the plane, but for the moment that would justify the silence, the stillness, the smirks, and the sideways glances. The moment where truth wouldn't need to be spoken aloud. It would just be. A few rows behind him, a woman opened her tablet and zoomed in on the blurry photo she had taken earlier, of him. She frowned, enlarged it, tilted her head. Then, quietly, she deleted it. She didn't know why. But it felt right. She hadn't captured anything the camera could translate. Shaq looked out the window now. The clouds were thinning, the rain beginning to dry on the tarmac. Planes moved like quiet titans in the distance. The city pulsed behind the glass. But he wasn't thinking of planes. He was thinking of Kendrick, of the promise, of the moment the world would be made to remember. The airline lounge wasn't built for discomfort. Soft lighting, curated jazz, complimentary champagne, and plush seating formed a gentle cocoon against the chaos of terminals. Conversations were usually low and lazy. Mergers, market shifts, missed connections. But today something was off. Something unspoken had shifted the tone in the room. The kind of shift that happens when someone walks in who doesn't match the wallpaper. Shaq had entered without fanfare. No staff escort, no assistant trailing his steps. Just the same worn backpack slung over one shoulder, and a day's worth of judgment already settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just out of place, he was a question mark in a room full of exclamation points. He selected a seat near the far window, one with a panoramic view of the runway. He didn't look at anyone. Just sat with the quiet intensity of someone deep in thought, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of warm water. No coffee, no tea, just heat between his fingers. He stared outward as if the planes moving across the tarmac were metaphors only he understood. That's when the whispers started. 3 rows over, a man in a gray checkered suit leaned into his wife's ear. He was worth over $400 million. Right? Maybe this is what happens when it all goes wrong. His tone wasn't cruel, just curious. The same way people rubberneck at a crash they don't understand. Behind the snack bar, a young woman in a navy pantsuit texted furiously. Her screen lit up with, "Shaquille O'Neal just walked into our lounge in rags. Is this real?" Across from the bar, 2 marketing reps from a startup argued in low tones. "I'm telling you, it's some kind of stunt. Social commentary, maybe. Rich people love pulling those fake homeless things for TikTok or activism." Nah. Did you see his eyes? That wasn't a bit. That man's been somewhere heavy. At the far end of the lounge, watching from behind a tablet, sat Graham Wexley, mid-50s, tailored navy blazer, polished cufflinks, and the kind of face that came with a practiced half-smile. He worked in strategic communications for a top-tier corporate lobbying firm. His job was to smell narrative before it even hit the room. And what he smelled now wasn't scandal, it was something more valuable. A mystery. He set the tablet down slowly, and watched Shaq, not with pity, but with interest sharpened by instinct. The posture, the quiet, the absence of chaos around him. Graham had seen celebrities lose control, melt down, erupt, but never retreat like this. The silence was too precise, too heavy to be accidental. He stood and walked to the self-serve espresso machine, half for the caffeine, half to get a better angle. As he stirred his cup, he noticed Shaq's reflection in the window. The man hadn't moved in 10 minutes. Just stared, not at planes but at the distant sky, like something was coming for him that hadn't landed yet. Shaq's backpack rested against his ankle, protected but casual. Graham zeroed in on it. He'd seen agents cradle launch files with less care. Whatever was in that bag, it mattered more than anything else in the room. He returned to his seat, but didn't pick up his tablet again. Instead, he pulled out a notepad from his leather briefcase and jotted one word. Observe. Nearby, the bartender, finishing up a restock under the counter, whispered to a security staffer. Is he even allowed in here dressed like that? VIP pass. Red Star clearance. The guard muttered, checking his earpiece. Means he can wear pajamas if he wants. But he's not wearing pajamas. He's wearing grief, the bartender said, half joking but not really. Shaq finally shifted. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded page. No one could see what was on it, but he read it carefully, like it was the only page that mattered. Then he folded it again and tucked it back inside the front pocket. Graham leaned forward slightly, catching the movement. A page that Warren didn't hold directions or reminders. It held memories. The room began to recalibrate. Whispers gave way to tension. People felt his silence like a draft under a locked door. It made them fidget. Lounge conversations turned erratic. Even those who hadn't noticed him earlier were now pulled into the orbit of speculation. A corporate team lead, named Lindsay, opened her LinkedIn and searched Shaquille O'Neal bankruptcy. Just to feel in control of the narrative. No results matched what she expected. A few rumors, some clickbait. But nothing current. Nothing that explained this. The lounge host, a slender woman with short blonde hair and too much mascara, approached Dana discreetly. Do we need to ask him anything? Dana shook her head. He's not breaking any rules. He's not disturbing anyone. He's disturbing everyone, the host replied. That's not his fault. Graham's eyes never left Shaq. He'd seen enough to know when someone was staging something. This wasn't performance. It was purpose. The kind that comes with scars beneath the surface. Suddenly Shaq's gaze shifted. Not outward, but inward. His shoulders tightened just slightly. The change was subtle, but Graham noticed. So did a few others who'd been watching too long. Someone important had just entered the lounge. Through the sliding doors came a man in a blazer, with a senator's lapel pin, briefcase in hand, surrounded by two aides. His name was Reynolds Dayne, a policymaker known for appearing woke on camera, but cutting corners behind closed doors. He didn't notice Shaq at first, but the moment their paths aligned, something passed between them. Dayne's face locked up, just for a second, just enough to show recognition. Shaq didn't blink. He just nodded once. Not hello, not acknowledgement. A warning. Reynolds didn't stop walking, but his aides noticed the shift. One leaned in and whispered. That was Shaquille O'Neal. I know, Dayne whispered back, his jaw tight. Keep moving. Graham caught the entire exchange. Now he had a thread. Something had happened. Something between that man and Shaq, and it wasn't public. He opened a new tab on his phone. Searched Reynolds Dayne. To Shaquille O'Neal. Nothing surfaced, not immediately. But he saved the search. Shaq returned to stillness. But the room didn't. The lounge had become a live wire. Everyone sensing tension but not knowing where it would land. A woman nearby whispered to her friend. Do you think he's waiting for someone? The friend replied. He looks like someone who's already lost what he was waiting for. Shaq's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. The warmth inside had gone cold long ago. But he held it anyway, because it gave his hands something to do while the storm inside him raged silently. Graham rose again. He walked slowly to the window where Shaq sat. Not directly beside him, just near enough. He took a stool, one seat away. Sat. Didn't speak. Shaq didn't acknowledge him. But he knew. The two men sat there, both watching the sky, the runway, the waiting. Finally Graham jotted something in his notepad. He didn't hide it. Made sure Shaq could see the words as he closed the pad. Why now? Shaq didn't answer. Didn't even glance. But as Graham stood to leave, he looked down and saw that Shaq had pulled the framed photo from his bag. The same one from the TSA inspection. The boy, that smile, the broken gym wall behind him. Shaq placed it on the table in front of him like an altar. Graham froze. Everything in his gut told him this story wasn't about a man losing something. It was about a man about to reveal something. And maybe burn the whole house down. Not with fire, but with truth. He walked away slowly, but his mind raced. In the far corner, Shaq leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the glass. He wasn't here to board a flight. He was here to be seen before something bigger arrived. The kind of moment that breaks silence with revelation. She walked into the lounge like she owned the air around her. Her heels didn't click. They arrived. Each step measured. Each glance deliberate, as though she expected the room to adjust its rhythm the moment she entered. And in a way it did. Carmela Devane, late 40s, wrapped in a red wool trench coat tailored within an inch of its life. Blonde waves tied into a loose twist. A subtle diamond pendant resting below her collarbone. She exuded wealth, not in the loud way, but in the way that dared people to guess just how much. The kind of woman who didn't carry money. She carried access. She scanned the lounge like it was an auction lot, eyes pausing only when she spotted an empty leather seat near the window. 2 seats over, Shaq sat in the same still position, hands loosely wrapped around a paper cup. His gaze hadn't moved. But the tension in the space shifted again. She didn't notice him at first, or if she did, she dismissed him with the same mental flick she used for parking valets and quiet janitors. She set her purse on the chair beside her, pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through stock reports. A glass of mineral water arrived at her elbow within minutes. Routine. The world bent for her comfort. But when she reached for her bag to retrieve her wallet, something small and black slipped from it and landed near Shaq's foot. She didn't notice. Shaq did. He leaned forward, picked it up. A fine leather wallet. Initials embossed. CD. He held it for a moment, his large hand dwarfing it, and then turned slightly. With no ceremony, no grand gesture, he placed the wallet gently on the small table between them. Carmela looked up, surprised, momentarily confused. She locked eyes with him, just briefly, that face shadowed by a beard, tired around the edges. She didn't recognize him. Or maybe she didn't want to. She picked up the wallet without a word.
No thank you. No nod.
She turned back to her tablet like it never happened. Shaq looked out the window again. No change in expression. But something had moved under the surface. The smallest ripple, like a wind brushing a still lake. 15 minutes passed. Carmela shifted in her seat more than once. Her tablet screen remained idle for a stretch. Her eyes not really reading anymore. She tapped her finger against the rim of her glass. A rhythm only she could hear. Then she leaned toward the lounge host. "Could you keep an eye on the man in the corner?" she asked. Low, calm, like she was ordering another water. "He's been watching people." The host tilted her head. "Which man?" She nodded subtly toward Shaq. "Him." The host's brow wrinkled. "Unsure. He's cleared. VIP. Not a problem." "I didn't say he was a problem," Carmela replied. "I just said watch." It wasn't the words. It was the tone. Back straight, voice soft, but laced with authority that had been earned not by wisdom but by decades of privilege being treated as proof of virtue. The host nodded stiffly, then turned away. Shaq hadn't moved, but he had heard, or sensed, or maybe he already knew. Because a few minutes later he finally turned his head, slow, unthreatening, and looked at her. Not at her clothes, not at her face, but into her. Carmela stiffened. Her grip tightened around the edge of the tablet. She cleared her throat and refocused on her screen, but her eyes betrayed her. Something had cracked, something old. And for a second, because the thing about Carmela Dayne, the detail her polished presentation never included, was that this wasn't the first time she had seen that face. Years ago. A fundraiser in Miami. Private exclusive. Charitable in name, but transactional in spirit. A youth rehabilitation initiative. Fronted by suits but funded by people like her. Wealthy donors looking to tax shelter their guilt. Shaq had been there, not as a guest, but as a surprise speaker. Back then, he'd worn a suit. Stood tall under a golden chandelier. Spoke in clear, unwavering tones about kids caught in systems they never built. About a boy named Kendrick, who couldn't get 10 minutes with a social worker, but got a lifetime's worth of silence from the justice system. Carmela had applauded, not out of feeling, but out of obligation. Everyone had. She hadn't remembered his words, but he had remembered her face. The disconnect stung more than it should have. And now, sitting 2 seats away from him, a woman who had donated 5 figures to a cause she never followed up on, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Seen, not admired. Seen, and not for her shoes or portfolio, but for the hollowness underneath. She stood abruptly and walked to the other side of the lounge, pretending to check her boarding pass. Her hands trembled slightly. Behind her, Shaq remained still, watching the runway, or maybe watching time pass over old sins. Graham, still nearby, noted the shift. He hadn't heard Carmela's words, but he saw the interaction, her stiffness, her retreat, another piece added to the puzzle. Carmela lingered by the magazine rack, pretending to read a headline. Her mind raced. She searched for the name, Kendrick Jules. It flickered in her memory now. A name attached to a small boy with big eyes. She'd seen it in a pamphlet, smiled politely, forgot it by dinner. She turned slightly and looked back at him. Still there, still watching.
No confrontation.
No anger. Just a presence that told her the story hadn't forgotten her the way she had forgotten it. She walked out of the lounge without another word, not even realizing she left her glass unfinished. Shaq watched her go. Slowly, with the patience of someone who knew there was more to come. Not revenge, not outrage, just reckoning. And perhaps that was more disarming than anything else. He reached into his bag again and pulled out a single envelope. It was addressed to Carmela Dayne, with a postmark from 5 years earlier. Unopened. It had come back marked return to sender, recipient moved. He slid it into his lap and stared at it for a while. Then he put it back into the bag, carefully, as if the paper were brittle enough to break apart in his fingers. Because some truths took time. And some people had to see themselves in someone else's silence before they could hear their own guilt echo back. The gate buzzed with movement as boarding began, the kind of ritual chaos that airports knew too well. A robotic voice called out groups in order, and people rose like chess pieces pushed into action. Boarding Group 1, First Class, Priority Passengers. Everyone moved with purpose, scanning phones, adjusting bags, guarding their space in line like it meant more than the flight itself. Shaq stood, slow and steady, lifting his bag with that same quiet deliberateness he'd carried since the first step into the terminal. He wasn't in a hurry, he never was. But when he stepped forward toward the line, a ripple moved behind the counter. At the podium stood Riley again, checking IDs like a man guarding the gate to something sacred. His smirk returned the second he spotted Shaq moving forward. "You're not listed," Riley said before Shaq even reached the front. "Let's not make this awkward, okay?" Shaq held out his boarding pass, printed hours earlier by Dana. Riley didn't take it. "I don't know how you got this, but your name isn't showing on the manifest. Not under first business, or even standby. So unless you want to explain how you plan to get on this flight dressed like." He stopped himself, suddenly aware that other passengers were watching, even recording. Shaq didn't move, just waited, the boarding pass in his hand, silent and patient. Riley exhaled sharply and pulled up the manifest on his screen again, searched manually, page by page. Nothing. Then Dana walked over. "Riley," she said, voice tight but composed. "Let me see." Riley stepped aside reluctantly. Dana clicked through the back-end admin menu, entered a clearance code Shaq hadn't seen anyone else use. The screen shifted, a new tab unlocked. She opened it, and then stopped. There it was, Red Star Override. Not just VIP, not celebrity level. This was internal executive clearance, something tagged by someone higher up than anyone in the airport had access to. A flight privilege normally reserved for federal officials, government contracts, and rarely security-sensitive passengers whose identities were shielded for classified reasons. She read the note aloud, but only part of it. Passenger pre-cleared by internal protocol. Do not challenge access. Riley blinked. What does that even mean? "It means he boards," Dana said, her tone flat, her eyes not leaving the screen. "But the system," Riley started. "The system already made its choice," she cut in. Passengers stared as Shaq handed over the boarding pass. Dana scanned it. The green checkmark blinked, and the gate doors unlocked with a soft click. He walked through without a word, without looking back, and the confusion left in his wake was louder than any announcement. Riley turned to Dana, whispering now, angry but contained. "Who flagged that override? Who even has that kind of authority?" Dana didn't answer. She just watched the boarding tunnel like it had swallowed something bigger than it could hold. Inside the jet bridge, cool air blew in steady gusts. Shaq moved down the hallway, a tunnel of white and steel, where silence replaced all the stairs. The crew at the door hesitated when they saw him. Unsure, but their screen showed the clearance too. They nodded, directed him to his seat, 2A, left window. He placed the backpack at his feet, sat, and leaned his head against the glass. Outside, the city pulsed in the distance. Inside, a storm was beginning to form, not from clouds, but from truth. Back at the gate, Riley was still pacing. "You saw his clothes. You saw the bag. That's not someone who belongs in first." Dana looked at him, and for the first time that day, something cold surfaced in her voice. "Maybe it's not about what he wears. Maybe it's about what he carries." Riley scoffed. "Come on. Who is he to get that kind of access?" She turned her screen slightly, then turned it back. The kind of person who doesn't need to announce himself to be important. And just like that, Riley fell quiet. In the cabin, Shaq sat still. He hadn't touched the in-flight water bottle or the folded blanket on the seat beside him. He reached into his bag again, not pulling anything out, just checking. His fingers brushed the envelope, the photograph, and the small silver chain tucked inside the lining. Memories stirred. Not loudly, but insistently. From the row behind him, a man leaned slightly into the aisle to get a look, then quickly looked away. Half the cabin was watching him now. Not openly, not boldly, but with the unease that comes when the story someone's writing in their head suddenly stops making sense. The whispers from earlier returned, now behind seatbacks and under breath. That's really him, isn't it? But why is he on this flight? And why now? I thought he retired. Went quiet years ago.
Maybe he's sick. Maybe something happened.
They weren't wrong. Something had happened. A storm had been building long before today, and this flight wasn't an escape, it was the front line. As final boarding wrapped, and the cabin doors sealed, a flight attendant passed by, double-checking seatbelts. She glanced at Shaq's section, then paused. Her name tag read Lorie, early 30s, composed, sharp-eyed. She didn't say a word to him, but he noticed the flicker in her eyes. Recognition, yes, but not awe. Something deeper, something that said, I know why you're here, or at least part of it. He nodded once. She nodded back, and moved on. 30,000 feet would bring answers, but for now, all anyone could do was sit and wonder what story was walking up and down that aisle in quiet sneakers, carrying a backpack full of names the world had already forgotten. The seatbelt sign blinked to life. 35 minutes into the flight, accompanied by a soft chime and the kind of turbulence that didn't ask permission. The aircraft lurched slightly, enough for drink carts to wobble and overhead compartments to creak. Passengers instinctively braced. A few gasped, some clutched armrests they'd forgotten were even there. Shaq didn't flinch. His hands remained folded, resting over the faded zipper of his backpack like it held something sacred. His eyes, half-lidded until now, lifted slowly to the aisle as the plane shifted again, this time more abruptly, drawing a collective inhale from the cabin. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a bit of rough air ahead. Nothing out of the ordinary. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be through it shortly. The voice was calm, trained, but there was a tremor in it. Not fear. Focus. The plane shuddered again, this time with a deeper dip. A glass clinked to the floor somewhere. A baby started crying. In row 6, someone's phone slipped off a tray table and hit the floor with a hard crack. People started looking around, not for help, but for reassurance. Then, just 2 rows ahead of Shaq, an elderly man groaned, sharp and sudden. His head fell backward, chin jutting toward the ceiling. His wife beside him panicked, her hands trembling as she shook his shoulder. He didn't respond. Another passenger stood halfway. He's having a heart attack. Someone help. The flight attendants unbuckled and rushed over. Shaq was already on his feet. He moved with no hesitation, no second guessing. His large hands were steady, controlled, the pace of his motion quiet and exact. Like this wasn't the first time he'd done this. Like he didn't just know what to do, but had already rehearsed it 100 times in his mind. Sir, please return to your seat, one attendant started, then stopped when she saw him drop to his knees beside the man. He gently moved the wife aside, reassuring her with only his eyes. He checked the man's pulse, his breathing, and placed 2 fingers to the man's neck. His other hand adjusted the collar, loosened the belt, tilted the seat slightly. The attendants froze for a second, then obeyed when he spoke. Calm, brief instructions, low enough to soothe but direct enough to move. Bring the AED, he said to one. Elevate his feet, he told another. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some raised phones instinctively, but most couldn't bring themselves to hit record. This wasn't a scene. It was a moment. Shaq performed chest compressions with measured rhythm, counting under his breath. He paused only when the defibrillator arrived, attached the pads, adjusted placement. The machine blinked. The beeping was loud in the pressurized silence. After a tense 5 seconds, the man's body jerked slightly. Another pulse, another count. Shaq placed a hand behind the man's head and whispered something inaudible. The man coughed, weakly. But it was enough. His chest rose again. His wife broke into tears. Shaq didn't say a word. Just nodded once to the flight attendant beside him and slowly backed away. The cabin burst into relieved murmurs. A smattering of soft applause. Not the loud clapping kind that fills stadiums, but something gentler, human, honest. Shaq returned to his seat like he had just refilled someone's drink. Nothing about his body language sought gratitude or recognition. He placed his bag back under the seat and leaned into the headrest, breathing slowly through his nose. The lead attendant, Lorie, watched him carefully now. She'd worked in the air for almost a decade and had seen panicked volunteers, off-duty nurses, and more than a few false heroes. But this was something else. She walked to the cockpit, said something quietly to the first officer. He leaned toward the captain. Moments later, the cabin speakers popped again. "Mr. O'Neill," came the captain's voice. This time with no ambiguity, no protocol buffer. "Thank you. We're informed of your clearance and assignment. Please let us know if you need any additional access. We're with you." The entire cabin fell into an electric silence. That name, spoken with precision. Not Shaq, not Big Man, not that guy.
Mr. O'Neill.
Passengers looked around, puzzled, confused. What assignment? Who exactly was he to get cockpit acknowledgement at 30,000 feet? The man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the row ahead tried to glance back without making it obvious. People were trying to rewrite what they thought they knew about him. Not from the surface, but from the signals now showing through the cracks. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't acknowledge the call. He just closed his eyes for a few seconds, breathing through what felt more like memory than relief. Lorie returned to him, crouched beside his seat. Her voice was hushed. "We were told someone with Red Star classification would be on board today. We didn't know it would be you." He opened his eyes, nodded once. "I won't ask why," she added, almost whispering. "But I hope whoever you were here for understands the weight you're carrying." He looked at her, not harsh, not solemn. "Just present." "She didn't," he said finally, voice low but clear. "But maybe she will now." Lorie didn't ask more. She didn't need to. She walked away with more questions than answers, but with a deep understanding that something far bigger than turbulence was moving through that cabin. At the front of first class, a man named Jonas Ketter, corporate strategist and opportunist, had been watching the entire sequence unfold. He'd recognized Shaq earlier, but had assumed this was some post-celebrity retreat into obscurity, a personal meltdown, a fall from wealth. But now, he was rethinking everything. He typed something on his phone. "Red Star clearance. O'Neill on flight 237. He hit send. Across the country, an auto reply bounced back. "Restricted Screginet alert." The message self-erased. Jonas sat back, cold now, nervous. Beside him, the woman from the lounge. Carmela hadn't spoken a word since boarding. She had seen the collapse, seen Shaq move, seen the whisper between him and the captain. And she remembered the envelope. She reached into her handbag. It was there, still unopened, still sealed. She pulled it out, staring at her own name written in handwriting she didn't recognize, but couldn't deny. Carmela Devane. She didn't open it. She wasn't ready yet. In the seat behind her, Graham Wexley watched all of this with quiet fascination. The threads he'd begun following at the airport were now tying themselves together in a knot so tight it pulsed. He looked down at his notes again. Scribbled across the page in bold black ink were the words, "He's not just flying, he's delivering something."
Then, underneath it,
"What do you carry when you've lost everything, except purpose?" The plane settled. The turbulence passed. The elderly man was stable, resting, his wife holding his hand like it had just come back to life. And in seat 2A, Shaq watched the horizon begin to shift, as clouds gave way to blue, not because the storm had passed, but because they were finally flying through it. There's a certain weight to memory when it doesn't belong to just one person, when it's carried on behalf of someone who never had the chance to leave theirs behind. That's the kind of memory Shaq held close, not in his mind but in the seams of the tattered clothes he wore, in the folds of the letters in his backpack, in the cracked edges of a photo frame that had seen more loss than light. The man sitting quietly in seat 2A wasn't mourning in the way people understood it. He was preparing, and behind his calm, the full story finally began to unfold. It started 3 years earlier, in a city like this one, though colder in its silence. Shaq had spent most of his public life surrounded by lights, sound, and stadium roars, but in his private time, The years after fame stopped flashing cameras in his face, he had found purpose in the forgotten corners. Recovery centers, shelters, veterans' homes, youth halls clinging to crumbling budgets. No media, no announcements, no hashtags. He visited them one by one, meeting the directors, walking through hallways that smelled of linoleum and quiet desperation. He wrote checks, paid electric bills, funded therapy programs. He never put his name on the plaques. That wasn't the point. One of those places, Hope House, sat 2 blocks from a cracked sidewalk where Bus Line 18 ran, a shelter for homeless teens and veterans alike. It ran on fumes and borrowed hope. That was where he met Kendrick Jules. Kendrick was 12 when they met. Shy at first, thin and full of nerves, with a quick wit that cut through any silence he walked into. The kind of kid who had learned how to disappear when adults raised their voices. He had bounced through shelters, juvenile centers, foster homes, but at Hope House, he stayed. Shaq never tried to save him. That wasn't the relationship. He listened, took him to games, taught him how to move quietly in a world that made noise only for the wrong people. And when Kendrick asked why someone like him, someone like Shaquille O'Neal, was sitting in a peeling community center instead of a luxury suite, Shaq only answered with a shrug. Not everyone needs to see what matters. Just the people it matters to. They built a rhythm. Kendrick began writing letters, the kind you write when your voice feels too small in the world. He left them on Shaq's car dashboard after sessions. Notes about injustice, about a school principal who called him aggressive for asking to retake a test, about his mother's eviction, about walking 4 miles for Wi-Fi. Shaq read them all, kept them. Then came the fire. One night, an electrical fault. That's what the report claimed, but the neighborhood knew better. The graffiti on the wall before it burned. The threats made anonymously, but too specifically. Someone didn't want that shelter standing anymore. Not with the kids it protected, not with the programs it offered that pulled bodies from the streets and placed them in classrooms instead of cells. 2 residents died. Kendrick survived the fire, but something else began burning inside him. A few months later, waiting for a bus, Kendrick was approached by 2 older boys from across the tracks. They used words Kendrick had heard before, but this time, they came with fists, with spit, with laughter, with no intervention. By the time paramedics arrived, Kendrick's pulse had faded. There were no arrests, no trial, no public outcry, only Shaq. He buried Kendrick quietly, with the boy's remaining family, in a small plot shaded by a pecan tree. The same photo he now carried in his bag was taken that day. Kendrick in a framed jersey. Shaq had given him, smiling like the world hadn't broken yet. After that, Shaq stopped showing up at galas. He stopped posing for photos. He stopped responding to brand offers. Instead, he walked. In every city Kendrick had been forced to survive, Shaq retraced his steps. He wore his clothes, or ones like them. Shoes a size too worn. A hoodie stitched with the logo of a shelter. No longer standing. He carried Kendrick's letters in his bag, not laminated, not preserved. Raw. He was stopped, mocked, recorded, judged. None of it surprised him.
That was the point.
He wanted to be mistaken for invisible. He wanted to understand what Kendrick saw before the world let him fall through it. When the letters stopped making sense to the media, when they realized this wasn't a publicity stunt, when no TV crews followed, when no sponsors emerged, they stopped watching. But the courts didn't. Because before the fire, before the fists, Kendrick had written one final letter. It had been addressed to a district attorney. With Shaq's help, it described harassment from local enforcers, warnings from rival groups, and a building sense that he was being followed. The letter had gone unread in an inbox for 6 months, until the day it became evidence. Shaq had kept a copy, and that was why this flight mattered. Because today, in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., a case was being heard, not about Kendrick's murder, which had never made it to trial, but about systemic negligence, cover-ups, and financial sabotage that had gutted youth shelters like Hope House across multiple cities. Shaq wasn't just a witness. He was a whistleblower. Because the Red Star clearance didn't come from his celebrity. It came from the Department of Justice. Shaq had partnered quietly with a group of civil rights attorneys to build a case that had been stitched together from city to city. Donation records, emails, withheld repairs, and deliberate defunding. The kind that didn't come with direct fingerprints but with enough institutional rot to stain every hand involved. The flight he was on now, it wasn't to escape. It was to testify. Not as a celebrity, as a man who carried a boy's name, because the world refused to. As the clouds thinned around the plane and the captain announced descent, Shaq reached into his bag and unfolded the letter Kendrick had written in pencil, just weeks before the fire. His handwriting was messy but strong. I don't want to disappear. I want to mean something to somebody who doesn't need me to be loud to be heard. Shaq folded the letter again and placed it back beside the frame. The envelope for Carmela remained tucked away. It wasn't time yet. A few rows back, the woman who had silently deleted her earlier photo of Shaq now opened her phone again, not to capture him, but to search the name Kendrick Jules. This time, something came up. A public court schedule, a sealed federal hearing, an unlisted witness name marked only as SJ, and in the bottom right corner of the docket, a logo, DOJ, Civil Rights Division. The truth wasn't just behind the clothes, it was stitched into them, into every stare he endured, into every doorway that didn't open, into every system that had looked away when it mattered most. The cabin tilted slightly as the descent began. The city of Washington stretched below like a grid of consequence. Shaq didn't move, didn't tighten his grip, didn't blink. He was ready, because some people wear suits to testify, and others walk into courtrooms wearing the pain they were told to forget. So no one else. The wheels touched down with a soft screech and a breathless hush. A city rose outside the oval windows, marble and iron, a skyline laced with decisions and denials. Washington, D.C. didn't welcome people, it measured them. Inside the cabin, the passengers straightened, seatbelts clicked, screens went black, bags were tugged from under chairs, and overhead bins, as if they'd never belonged anywhere else. But no one moved toward the aisle just yet, because Shaq was still seated, still calm, still wearing the same clothes, the same expressionless focus. No applause now, no shock, just something heavier than before. Awareness. As the plane rolled toward the gate, a different kind of buzz filled the air, one that had nothing to do with turbulence. Cell phones began to ping. Headlines popped up. Push alerts flashed across home screens. Unconfirmed. Shaquille O'Neal to testify in DOJ civil negligence trial today in D.C. Red Star passenger ID'd as Shaq. DOJ witness protected for high-profile shelter case. The first photos had leaked, blurry, grainy stills from someone who'd filmed during takeoff. One image had already gone viral. Shaq kneeling over the elderly man mid-flight, hands calm, eyes locked on the rhythm of CPR. By the time the aircraft stopped at the jet bridge, a crowd had gathered behind the glass. Cameras, boom mics, journalists in coats with press badges flapping in the wind. Police stood nearby, not for a disturbance, but for protection. Inside the cabin, Carmela stared forward, her fingers clenched around the envelope she still hadn't opened. Her hair was neater now, her lipstick faded. She hadn't said a word since the name Kendrick Jules appeared on her newsfeed an hour ago. Now her chest rose and fell with the quiet kind of ache only realization could cause. She looked at Shaq, truly looked, and it hit her like a pulse behind the eyes. She had donated to the fund that had been siphoned. She had attended the benefit where Kendrick's name was a bullet point in a speech. And she had forgotten all of it. Her hands trembled as she whispered to no one. I didn't know, but Shaq didn't turn. Didn't need to. Truth doesn't need eye contact to sting. Behind them, Riley stood near the galley, watching the back of Shaq's head. He wasn't cocky now. His posture was different, looser, smaller somehow. His fingers tapped against his own thigh, rehearsing something he wasn't sure he had the right to say. When the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers rose in instinctual order, but no one reached for the aisle first. Instead, Shaq stood slowly, lifting his bag with both hands like it contained something living. He turned toward the front, and Riley stepped forward. I judged you, he said, voice low, cracking under the strain of clarity. Shaq looked at him, not with hostility, not even disappointment. Just history. You laughed, Shaq said evenly. That's all I remember. The words didn't carry heat, but they burned just the same. Riley nodded, his eyes falling to the floor. I was wrong. Shaq didn't reply. He didn't need to. Not every wound asks for a bandage. Sometimes it just wants to be acknowledged. As he stepped into the front of the cabin, the door opened, and the first waves of noise crashed in. Cameras clicking like applause, reporters shouting questions that couldn't reach him through the silence he carried. He didn't stop, didn't speak, just walked forward into a corridor of microphones, an uncertainty, flanked by U.S. Marshals, whose expressions were unreadable. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Not all at once, but in ripples. One of the passengers, a woman in her 30s who had scrolled past him earlier with thinly veiled judgment, stood in the aisle. She looked around at the others. The same people who had stared, recorded, whispered. "I judged him too," she said quietly. No one responded. She didn't expect them to. But that sentence dropped into the quiet, changed the energy. Graham Wexley remained in his seat, watching the runway through the glass. He tapped his pen against his pad, the deal pitch he'd once mentally crafted now crumbling into irrelevance. He had approached Shaq before landing, casually offering a platform. "We could help you tell your story," he'd said. "The right way." Shaq hadn't laughed, hadn't smirked, just responded without pausing. "Stories don't need handlers. They need honesty." Then he'd walked past him. Graham scratched the offer off his page now. That story would tell itself. And if it didn't, maybe that was the point. On the tarmac, Shaq walked toward a black sedan with tinted windows and a plain government plate. One of the marshals opened the back door. He didn't get in. Not yet. He turned once, faced the crowd. Not to pose, to let them see him.
As he was.
Not performing. Not broken. Not in costume. But carrying someone, Kendrick, and everyone who had walked like him. Unseen until something made them vanish. Inside the plane, Carmela finally opened the envelope. It held no letter. Just a copy of Kendrick's last school portrait, curled at the corners, still warm from the sun. Shaq had carried it under. On the back, written in black marker, "He meant something, and you still can too." She lowered it slowly, tears hot against her cheek. It wasn't shame. It was recognition. Outside, the press shouted questions. Shaq got into the car without answering. The door shut, but the sound echoed like a verdict. Because sometimes the loudest thing in the world is someone not defending themselves. And sometimes, the greatest shock isn't what a person says. It's who they decide not to become in front of a crowd. The automatic glass doors parted with a whisper, as Shaq stepped out into the daylight.
No red carpet, no flashing lights, no entourage waiting with umbrellas, or camera-ready smiles, just the soft hum of wind across the concrete, and the scent of fresh jet fuel lifting off the tarmac behind him. The sun hit his face fully now, not filtered through airplane windows or terminal glass. It was direct, exposing, clean.
For a moment he paused at the threshold, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Behind him sat a plane full of passengers who would walk out into their day changed, whether they admitted it or not. A flight that had started in mockery and misunderstanding now lingered in silence and self-reflection. Their journey wasn't over. Neither was his. Parked a few yards from the curb. Wasn't a limo, not an SUV, not a tinted sedan, not a security motorcade. It was a van. Old, slightly rusted around the edges. Beige, with fading letters still visible beneath years of scrub. Hope House Community Program. The same logo painted on the wall behind Kendrick in the photo. Shaq still carried. The van door creaked open. Inside sat a woman, late 50s, strong frame, soft hands. Her name was Marlene, the former shelter director, who had once let Shaq sleep on her couch during his first unannounced visit years ago. She smiled at him, small and proud. He climbed in, ducking slightly, folding into a seat like it was made for someone else, because it always had been. No cameras followed, but stories had already begun moving through the city like wind chasing leaves. Inside the terminal, the fallout had started, quietly, and without press releases. Riley, standing just outside Gate 12B, had received an email 30 minutes before the flight touched down. Subject line: mandatory internal reorientation, racial empathy and frontline bias. The sender field was blank, but the signature read only, approved and funded, a friend of Kendrick Jules. He wasn't the only one. Dana received the same email. Elise, the lounge host. Even Graham, who had half-pitched a media offer and had been left with nothing but notes and a shifting moral compass, received a version addressed to narrative architects in positions of privilege. They didn't know the full picture yet, but someone had taken control of the system from behind the curtain, and that someone had worn out shoes. A bigger twist hadn't surfaced publicly yet, but those closest to the back end of the airport's corporate pipeline had already noticed something strange in the files: a silent buyout, a low-key transfer of ownership initiated weeks ago. The airline's private shares had shifted hands in a trust so sealed even internal counsel couldn't trace the source. The paper trail ended at a Delaware holding shell called J&K Equity Trust. Internally, employees whispered that it might have been an international group, a mobility startup, or some quiet corporate maneuvering. But the truth was simple. Shaquille O'Neal bought the airline, not to profit, but to prove a point, not with punishment, but with perspective, not as a billionaire making a spectacle, but as a man walking the exact path a boy named Kendrick never got to finish. He had spent years speaking for the voiceless. This time he wanted them to speak through his silence. The van took a side road out of the airport, past terminals, past signs pointing to official parking, and departures. It curved into the city through less familiar streets, the kind that tourists didn't walk and cabs didn't linger in. Marlene kept her eyes on the road, but her voice was low, warm. "They've been asking about you." He looked over, one brow raised. "The kids," she said. "The ones who remember. They heard about Kendrick. They saw your name on that court schedule. You know what they asked me?" He didn't respond. They asked if the man in the worn-out hoodie was still the same one who gave Kendrick his first basketball shoes. He smiled then. Not for joy, but for memory. A few minutes later, they stopped at a corner near an elementary school. Shaq stepped out. Marlene nodded. She didn't need to ask where he was going. He walked the rest of the way alone, past the brick wall that used to hold the Hope House banner, past the now boarded-up storefront that once served warm soup in winter, past the telephone pole, where Kendrick's missing poster had briefly fluttered before someone tore it down. He walked until he reached a mural, fresh, still drying. On the wall was Kendrick's face painted 10 feet tall, his jersey number below, and a phrase beside it in bold black letters. "Still here." Below that was a plaque. It didn't mention Shaq by name, just Kendrick, and one sentence etched into metal. "Because one man refused to stop walking." Shaq stood in front of it for a long while. Not crying, not praying, just present. Back at the airport, the internal systems continued recalibrating. The empathy training wasn't just symbolic, it was binding. Every mocking employee had been reassigned, not fired. That would be too easy. They were placed in roles that required human contact. Community service partnerships, rotations through recovery centers, volunteer mentoring, all paid for by a new fund installed discreetly into the airline's operating budget. Named only the Jules Initiative. The press kept trying to reach Shaq's team, but his number hadn't changed. He just wasn't answering. Because some answers didn't come in interviews. They came in footsteps, in choices, in the people we choose to remember. Later that week, one of the court reporters posted a photo. No press was allowed inside the hearing, but from outside the courthouse someone had captured a moment through the glass. Shaq standing, holding the framed photo of Kendrick, testifying under oath. His hand rested on the photo the entire time. And when asked why he had come, why a man of his stature, wealth, and legacy had chosen to walk instead of speak out through flashier means, he had responded simply, "Because Kendrick was worth showing up for, even if it's too late." That quote trended for days. But that wasn't what changed everything. What changed everything came a week later, when a letter surfaced online, anonymously posted by one of the passengers from flight. It was a scanned page, crinkled, slightly torn at the top. The handwriting was a child's. It read, "If the world forgets me, that's okay. Just make sure it remembers the next boy like me. Give him a chance, give him a seat, and maybe someday, let him fly without being stared at." It was signed, Kendrick Jules. The final words? "I hope the people who see him next remember more than what he wears. I hope they see what he's carrying." And just like that, the walk that had started with judgment ended in awakening. Not just for the man who walked it, but for everyone watching. If this story made you pause, look closer. Not at the man who walked, but at the system he walked through. Because someone out there is still waiting for a seat, a chance, a name to be remembered. This isn't the end of a story, it's the start of paying attention. Walk with us, not behind the headlines, but ahead of the silence.